Well, welcome to this month's webinar, When Operation Managers Go Rogue, the best ideas you need to try. I'm very excited about talking about this topic. As many of you know, I'm an operations guy at heart. That's where I started. That's really how I identify with myself. And it was great to come up with some stories of some very thoughtful folks and some things that I've been involved with over the years that have kind of changed how we look at operations. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you ask lots of questions. And well, hey, let's get going. Of course, we always need to stop and thank our sponsors. Thank you, sponsors. We put on these webinars. They are time consuming, but they're also not free. So Nationwide Video and Aviation Info USA and Digital Projection and Flex Rental and DWP Live and Complete Crewing, all these guys care enough about you to make sure that I keep doing this. So we want to thank them for that. And please visit their website, say hello to them, consider their services. They're all great folks. I am still me. I'm still Tom Stimson. I'm a business consultant. I do strategy, process, operations, sales, marketing, owner advice, all the things business in our AV industry, in our live events industry, that whole wild and interesting vertical. So thank you folks for following me. And again, thanks for joining. All right, now here's the magic question. Are you the fly or are you the windshield? So very often, and where this all starts is that, that battle that I've heard about since I was a freelancer, when I was, schlepping fast fold screens in hotels and, setting up overhead projectors. I witnessed what appeared to be a pretty constant battle between the salesmen of an organization and the operations people or delivery people of the organization inside of AV companies. It's sales versus ops, sales versus ops. And invariably, I don't ever remember seeing ops win. Ops was always the fly. The windshield was sales. And, sometimes it was demoralizing to watch people. Now, I know that's not everybody's experience. And, fast forward 35 years later, we've all grown up a little bit. But the fact is, I work with dozens of companies every year in their offices with their teams, and I still see it. But I'm also seeing some really healthy signs that we're getting over it. And here's some of the things I'm seeing people do to help them. So if you're in a battle, you feel like you're in a battle where revenue wins and busy loses, and nobody cares that you're busy because we have revenue, so get over it. Pay attention. This is good stuff. I'm going to start with management's role. Because management's role is huge in all of this. A lot of the things I'm talking about, while you may go rogue and you may do something on your own, ultimately it's management's support that's going to allow it to continue to happen. So I want to make sure that management, and many of you on the phone are managers and owners and executives, need to understand you're not only part of the problem, you are a major part of the solution. Years ago, when many of you know I worked at Alford Media for many years. That's where I did my first real job growing up role, and we had an opportunity to get a preferred provider agreement with a major production company who shall remain nameless. And this is back in the 90s. And these things were fairly new. And so we filled out the forms. We've been doing business with them for years, but they were making us go through the process. And I was the primary contact, and I'm getting ready to sign the paperwork, the contract, the paper contract in the FedEx or whatever it was, and fill in my title. My title at the time was rental manager because, well, we didn't care about titles. And in fact, I'd been doing more than that for a long time. So I had to go to my boss and say, hey, look, we don't want to make this application with me signing this as rental manager, because rental manager is the guy with the desk in the warehouse. And we're talking about doing, $1 or $2 million a year of business with these people. So we agreed to come up with a new title. So we spent almost 10 seconds thinking about it and said, how about director of sales and operations? Because I ran sales and I ran operations. We said, hey, sounds good. Never realizing that nobody used that title. That was a an oxymoron. It's like, how can you be in charge of those two things? But that's what we did. And faced with this role, and I took the title to heart because I said, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to have this title, I need to think like this person. And how do you reconcile being in charge of both? And my answer became what I call the contract, my mantra. Sales' job is to sell whatever operations can support, and operations' job is to support whatever sales sells. And if we can manage those two expectations, everybody's going to be happy, everybody's going to win, everybody's going to be just a little bit disappointed that they didn't get their way. In other words, it's the perfect compromise for running a business. And it worked because I was in a position where I could make each side comply. I could put in the processes, the resources, the tool, or, sometimes just the leadership to make that happen. So I live by that. I teach that all the time. You've all heard me say it before. Management is responsible for making this contract work. It is a good idea. It does work with management support. So while I have operations people who want to believe this, and I have salespeople who want to believe this, or sales managers that want to believe this, everyone's got to believe it and buy into it. And then here are some of the cool things that could happen when you do. Now, management's got to support it. Here are some of the things that management has to provide to allow this to work. And this is remedial, folks. This is Management 101, but we have to say it. Management has to provide the process that allows these things to happen. You need to define standard procedures, and you need to eliminate exceptions wherever you can. We can't run a business as dynamic and complex as all of you have on exceptions. So how can we reduce the exceptions? Standard operating procedures will help that. It's all about process. You also need transparency. The distrust that occurs between sales and operations, and I think I wrote a blog post about that this week or last. One of the myths is we don't trust each other because we can't see what you're doing. We need to introduce transparency into the system, and we can do that with software tools, and we can do that with centralized resources. We need to stop compartmentalizing information. We need to make information available to more people so they can do their jobs based on the information that's available. And the third thing that makes this work, and this is equally important, is the ability to forecast. Forecasting for most of us is kind of a wet thumb sort of thing. You lick your thumb, stick it out in the window, and see, which side gets cold. We have to be better about that. We need to be able to predict. We need to be able to measure the quality of our predictions, and then we need to be able to make adjustments based on what our measurements told us. You need to forecast. You will make mistakes, but you have to get better at it so you'll forecast better. And the more you forecast and the more you measure it, the better you're going to get at it. And the better your forecast, the better relationship you're going to have between sales and operations. You're going to be able to plan better, and we'll see some of that in a few of the examples and stories I'm going to tell today. And then one more thing I want to say about leadership and management, and particularly the ops leadership, is you need to change your mindset. I'm told all the time that we're an emergency-driven business. And I'm going, if you have that many emergencies, you're really lousy at running a company. Okay, we need to, emergencies are normal. I've been doing this for 35 years. Emergencies are normal. Okay, so they're not really an emergency. There's something you should expect and you should plan for them. And if you have a culture where people are heroes or get to be heroes all the time, then your operation is not healthy. You're not running a normal operation. You're being reactionary. So if the hero of the week is the guy who jumped in the truck, whose job, oh, by the way, is to jump in the truck, then you've got a problem. If the hero of the week is the person who jumped in the truck who shouldn't have jumped in the truck because he didn't plan well enough, then you've got a problem. Process is your friend. I get pushback on process, but you know what works. Stop compromising on what works. That's a leadership mindset. Guys, make the process work. And if the process isn't working, then we need to change the process. But we have to follow the process. And the third thing that ops leadership can do to help everything is recognize that your building is full of internal customers. Everyone is your customer, inside, outside. Logistics is your customer, accounting is your customer. God forbid sales is your customer. Everyone's your customer. And honestly, we need to get over ourselves. Okay? We need to understand that we're in a service industry and we are doing most of the heavy lifting. That is our job in operations. So embrace it and start looking better at it. There. So enough of the soapbox. All right, let's talk about some of these rogue things. Staffing and crewing. Many of you know that my first company, my first business was a staffing company. Staffing is near and dear to my heart, and we developed some great staffing policies and procedures in the years that I was at Alford, and I continue to teach them because I continue to find people who aren't very good at this. And oh, by the way, the software that you're trying to use, some of you, is not helping you either. But we can understand staffing and crewing better. And the thing that I think most of us need to understand is a rogue discovery that I made early in my career, that we need to staff from resources first, not from the project first. And when I go to ops meetings and listen to people have their ops meetings, you know, they're always talking about they're laying a job out and then going and picking resources and dropping them into the job. When in fact, what we're supposed to do is exactly the opposite. And here's how I got here. Where's Danny? We had a crew member, we had a team member whose name was Danny, who traveled all the time. He was a field guy, he was a technician, and he was really bad at communicating with home. And I would get calls from his spouse who would say, "Where's Danny?" Well, I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, he's not home. I don't know where he is." "Well, he's in New Orleans." "Well, when is he coming back?" I was like, "How do you not know these things?" And so I had to start keeping a schedule for her, and I had to figure out how to track things. And because we'd been doing it from a job planning, I'd have to look through all the jobs to figure out which job Danny was on. Now, granted, this is 90s, we're very analog, but I had to go look through all the jobs. And so I had to figure out, you know, how many places should I have to look to find out where Danny is? I should just have a place that finds Danny. So that's what I developed, and I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. Part of what resource first planning means is I want to protect my resources. I want to protect my capacity because I'm going to trust forecasting. And my forecasting tells me I have demand. I'm not just responding to confirmed business. I'm not focusing just on work orders as an operations person. I'm looking at all the possibilities and knowing that I'm going to have to gather my resources together and probably have more people than it looks like I'm going to need. And if I'm going to do that, knowing that we are a business of surprises, and on your busiest week where every resource is tied up, every person is booked, your best customer is going to call with a non-negotiable request, and you're going to have to put together another crew and another show. So the busier you are, the more you need to keep in reserve, which means you book your best people last. Now, right now, I should be seeing questions typed in here or probably exclamation points, but book your best people last. So think about that. Now, here's the alternative. The alternative is what most of us do, which is demand side planning. I look at one job at a time. Here's the job I'm looking at. It gets the assets. If all the good assets are available, I'm going to put them on that job because there's nowhere else for them to go until another job comes along. Or if I have 3 jobs come along, they all want the same resource, and now they're competing for each other because each job wants to be populated. I want to help the jobs by making the best use of my assets. So I'm looking at the assets I have available and start putting those people into the mix. And while saving assets might seem wasteful to you, existing jobs will end up soaking up all the resources. So demand side planning doesn't work. You end up, all your best assets are tied up. you still have demand coming that you can't see in your forecast, or you don't trust your forecast, and all you're doing is creating problems down the road. It looks efficient because I haven't spent any money, but it's not because I haven't thought like a strategist and looked ahead at what my pipeline is really going to be doing for me. So these clipboards, I found these clipboards in a box in my closet, a year or two ago, and these were the original clipboards that I used back in the 1980s when I ran my business. And these were in daily use probably for more than 10 years. Even once we had computers, we were printing out forms and putting them on these clipboards, and the business agent, whoever they may be, carried the clipboards around. This was an important part of their life. And it had everybody's phone number on it and everybody's skill sets on it, so they knew who they could book people for. But we were doing the demand side planning. We would get a gig, an order. We need 8 stagehands at this hotel at this time, and then we'd go down the list and fill it. The way I would do it today, and the way I started doing it in the Where's Danny story, was I took all the people that we use and I put them on just a simple Gantt chart. Very much like you might get on your rental management software now if you use that to schedule people, or any of the other software as a services. My attitude is if you can't do it analog, you don't deserve to use the software that does it for you, because you won't understand how to use it. But even in this day and age, I can introduce this chart and this methodology for scheduling people into organizations and dramatically change their busy mindset and how they resource allocate people. And oh, by the way, you can do this with equipment sets as well. So the whole idea is I'm going to track each staff person and my key freelancers and recognize when I need to develop more freelance resources, for instance. That would be a great thing to understand, and allocate based on my forecast. Now, we needed one more thing to make this work, to finish the Where's Danny story, and that became what we affectionately called the rental meeting, or the Tuesday meeting, which was an open meeting to do resource allocation for people every single week. So we want to decentralize the selection of crew instead of having one person who sits there and makes the choices, who is subject to the pressures of, let me say, salespeople and or technicians and or freelancers to use them. We do it in more of a transparent committee format, putting a referee in the room, a decision maker. We look 60 days ahead. We book key roles sooner, but we might be tying up freelancers before staff. We'll be forcing new talent into the mix instead of going with our tried and true people, because we need to continually develop a deeper bench because you're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the transparency of the process brought sales and operations closer together. They each saw the challenges the other ones were dealing with in terms of busy, and we were busy as a company, not busy as a department. So if we needed to, as director of sales operations, if I needed to slow down sales, we would identify dates where adding additional projects would be more expensive. Once or twice a year, we would pick dates and say, don't sell anything on these dates. And then of course your best customer would call and you'd have to do it anyway. But it gave us the insight. It allowed us to exercise and show our forecasting to everybody so everybody could see what was going on. Now, why does this work? You're going to allocate a resource instead of filling a need. So you're looking at all jobs at the same time. And that's not saying I'm spreading out 60 days worth of jobs on a table and looking at them. I'm saying I'm looking at week 4 and how many jobs do we have going on? How deep do I need to go into my bench now? Okay. It changes the discussion of what busy is. So busy now becomes a quantified term. The only time you're actually busy or allowed to say you're busy is when you run out of people, because we all know you can get more equipment. So busy became a people issue. And my job as ops manager or department head or technical director or whatever it might be is to make sure that we're constantly getting more people so we don't run out of people so often. It encourages your sales team to engage with the client to get the job confirmed, to get on the list of the jobs we're going to book. If I got a wishy-washy salesperson, I won't say wishy-washy client, but a wishy-washy salesperson who's going, well, I don't know if this is going to confirm. I don't want to ask the customer yet. I don't want to scare them off. I don't want to bother them. When they start seeing that we're going to be really busy in April, they have a lot more confidence and a lot less fear of going to the client and saying, I want to get your crew tied up before we get any further. We're getting a little bit close. We need to tie up some good folks. And trust me, your client doesn't care about you tying up equipment. They care about the people they're going to get on the job. And this works because you're free. Again, this is the staffing guy talking now. It grows your freelance bench. The more freelancers you use, you don't give all the work to the same freelancers because they're loyal and they're good, because that undermines your operational mandate, which is to have a deeper bench. So it really forces you into growing your freelance bench. And then your freelancers, knowing that you're looking at this chart with their schedule on it, will actually share their personal schedule and let you know what days they're available and when they're not. Okay, let me back up here. I got a quick question. Somebody's asking a question. I expected this about unbooking freelancers. So what if you book a freelancer 3 months in advance and then, the client doesn't confirm the job or the client cancels the job? Well, that's a good question. It's going to happen. And typically, if you're booking a freelancer 3 months in advance, it's the job that you think is most likely going to go. You're probably 80% sure, but we all know that things happen. Rebook the freelancer somewhere else. So I may say, hey, that 7-day gig in Las Vegas, the client, something happened, job went away. However, I've got the 5-day gig in Nashville. Can I move you over to that? So rather than going, well, I lost 7 days of work, I could have sold it somewhere else, you're replacing it with 5 days of work and you're taking care of them. Even if you have to pull a staff person off the Nashville gig to put the freelancer on, you take care of the freelancer. Okay. Now you're going, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense from a math standpoint, but we're going to tell a story about that in just a minute. So thank you for the question. Oh, okay, another story. Now there are several of my clients will say this is the story about them. However, the story, the incident I'm picturing in my mind is not anyone who is on this call today, because I checked the list. So this is not about you. I walk into the warehouse, and usually I visit my clients 2, 3, or 4 times a year, and I keep walking into the warehouse and seeing the same giant pile of gear. Now it changes a little bit, but there's always this pile of gear. So what's the pile of gear? Okay, what is this? And this guy, well, that's equipment that's waiting to be checked in. Well, why aren't we checking it in? Well, because we're busy doing prep for the shows that have to go out. So when will it get checked in? When we're done doing prep. Well, when are you done doing prep? Well, we're never really done doing prep. So the quality control team in this particular case, and this was a huge pile of gear. This is, just put this in perspective. This is a tractor trailer load of equipment that hadn't been checked in on the average. And the quality control team and the prep team were the same. So nobody was available to check in because the prep team is doing quality control during the prep. So they have to check out all the equipment, do the bench focus, test the mixers, run signal through the speakers, fire up the cameras on every single job. So prep took sometimes 1 or 2 days, depending on the size of the job. And if they needed a piece of gear, they'd run back over to the pile, find the piece of gear, scan it in, go prep it, and then scan it into the new job. So the pile didn't decrease unless somebody did it. And it wasn't just their own gear that was in that pile, folks. It was their sub-rentals. Their sub-rentals were there. So this idea that all hands are on prep and prep comes first and QC comes later or check-in comes later is a problem. So while the manifest is I have this equipment that's not checked in, which, oh, by the way, was costing them a fortune, the issue was they were QCing at the wrong time, and they were QCing in the wrong priority. So when organizations do the quality control when they're prepping, theoretically, a piece of equipment's been checked in, has been pushed back to its place, and nobody's bothered to find out if it still works until it's needed. And the idea of prepping 2 or 3 days in advance is to give you enough time to fix all the stuff that's sitting on the shelf broken. Okay, so prep takes 4 times as long if you're QCing at the same time. And it takes a higher level of person to do the prep because they're also doing the QC. So QC problems are discovered much too late. And then you're doing sub-rental and supply ordering runs at the last minute. So you're asking to prep jobs even earlier, 3 days, 4 days, a week in advance. Okay, and you have all this idle time that's now created between the preps. So there's a whole lot of problems in resource allocation when you're doing QC on prep. Okay, the solution on this, when prep is more important than QC, you run into trouble. You need to make QC number one. And I'll get back to my pile here in just a minute. So we want to eliminate this last minute everything that QC on prep generates. So we make QC the number one priority. In this particular case, this was a warehouse for a good sized company. They had about 20 people on their QC prep team. So every department had 2 or 3 or 4 high level technicians and a couple of helpers to move equipment and do the light lifting and the cable counts and all that kind of stuff and checking cable. And if 20 people were working nonstop, sometimes 6 or 7 days a week. The warehouse manager, who didn't think that QC should come first or that check-in was a priority, refused to move people over to check-in. We offered to hire 4 people for him, and it was clear that he was just going to take them and use more people on show prep. So solution was we hired 4 warehouse workers and we gave them to logistics. We gave them to the dispatcher who ran all the trucks. The trucks came back. His team checked in all the equipment, scanned everything in, separated out the sub-rentals, got them returned ASAP. Everything got done in a timely manner, and the pile stayed empty. Now you're going, that cost a lot of money, Tom. It's like, well, not when you find out how much it cost to not do it. So the QC prep overtime suddenly start dropping. They weren't having to pick equipment out of a pile. The check-in crew was doing light QC and culling out the equipment that needed attention more quickly and sending it over to the repair desk. Their sub-rental back charges reduced by $180,000 in the first year, which pretty much paid for the 4 guys, who, by the way, never really had to work overtime. They had the most regular schedule in the entire warehouse. Eventually, the entire QC prep overtime was reduced by 50% because they were cutting down the amount of time they spent chasing stuff around. So it was a fascinating experiment. I've seen it in other organizations, and it's helping the warehouse manager understand that check-in is an all-hands task, not prep. So when a truck comes back in, everybody stop what you're doing, get the truck unloaded, scan everything in, do the QC, get it back on the shelf, and the gear is ready to go. Will take much less time being prepped. It will shorten your prep time, and it makes better use of your overall personnel utilization. And hang on, I'm watching somebody finish a question here. All right, question. There are some gear that needs to be prepped and QC'd at pull, moving lights. Okay, yeah. Not all equipment needs to be QC'd or needs a lot of handling at prep. Some does. That's what we'll save time for that. I will give lighting folks a little bit of a break on this. You've got to address movers, you've got to do cable looms. I understand that. But the rest of the departments don't have the same challenges. Cable, great cable story. We had at Alford, we had what we called the cable pit. And for the audio, lighting, no, audio and video and general AV departments all shared a cable pit with one person. And his job, he worked nonstop. You know, his 40-hour week was full, writing in, QCing a cable. So every cable case would come in, he'd unload it, he'd recoil all the cable that needed to be recoiled, check anything that needed to be checked, put it back into the bin, ready to go. Properly coiled, properly stacked. If it was a cable kit, he'd restock the cable kit. And he could do this all the time because we had enough cable that other jobs could go out with the cable that was already prepped. And then he could continue to prep cable based on with the excess inventory. So there's a lot of things that you can do more efficiently if you think in terms of check in right away, QC first, and then for some things, QC all the time. Okay. Franco, I see you have a question, but I don't understand what it is. So maybe you can clarify, or maybe it was a comment. I'll move on to the next thing, more staff, not less. Another rogue behavior. I do work with companies. I do run in companies all the time that are overstaffed. That's not uncommon. Overstaffing creates certain issues. It usually creates the mindset that we're always too busy. Overstaffing rarely leads to people being idle. It leads to people doing busy work. Now, having said that, I want to talk about the issue of understaffing, because I think understaffing is a little bit harder for people to get their head around. The problem with understaffing is you're not saving money. Okay, there's a lot of false economies in understaffing, particularly in the warehouses, or warehouses where you staff on demand, which is something I cannot get my head around. Okay, so employees on overtime are less expensive than temps is the argument. Well, I can run my guys on overtime because, you know, if I bring in a freelancer, they cost more money. Great. It creates the busy mindset, you know, the false economy. We're always busy because I don't have enough people. So you run more overtime, you don't have time to solve the problem. If you're short-staffed, you're always going to be reactive, and you create a culture of reactiveness. So priority work gets done, but maintenance and prep doesn't. And the all-hands approach means there's no fill-in work. So you don't get the maintenance tasks done. You don't get the cable checked. You don't tighten the connectors on the twist locks. You don't get the labels scraped off the cases. You don't do all the things that you need to do to be a high quality organization because you're too busy, because you're always short staffed. Okay. One organization I worked with gave me this idea. I had a similar methodology when I worked at Alford of doing the split shifts. And I've seen a couple variations on split shifts, but here's the one that I like. You know, first of all, we're going to reduce overtime by adding warehouse staff and drivers. So rather than be short-staffed and running a lot of overtime, I'm going to add staff and split the shifts. So I'm going to have more coverage and less overtime. So you add some warehouse staff, you add some drivers. The shift that they ran was 7 to 7. So they had a 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. crew and a 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. crew. And the early crew would take an early call. So if we needed to come in at 5 a.m. to turn some trucks, it was the early crew that would do that, but they still worked till 4, unless we could release them early. If there was something that had to happen late at night, it's the late crew. You give them a dinner break, they come back, you do the late turn at night. So everybody still got a little bit of overtime when appropriate, okay? But you had the early guys and the late guys. Pretty simple, right? What helped make this work was an on-call person who could keep a driver going, and drivers would work a flex schedule. So drivers didn't really have a fixed schedule. They had a dispatch schedule that said, okay, I need somebody to drive at 6 a.m. And after hours, the on-call person would keep the driver working. If we had a late night delivery, and oh, by the way, the nighttime guy would get the extra call and do the extra work. Okay. Weekend shifts in the split shift model became volunteer first. Who wants overtime this weekend? I need people on Sunday. I need people on Saturday. Overtime became volunteer. The people who could fit it into their life and their schedule got first crack at it. Okay. And after that, we had to assign. So if we don't have the volunteers that we need, we would do assignment. We also weren't afraid in this model to hire freelancers to do some of the work if our crew needed their time off. Okay. Yes, a freelancer on regular time might be a little bit expensive, but probably it's not more expensive than an overtime person, even though we sometimes think that. Question here. So guarantee 40 hours. So Tom, our employees guaranteed 40 hours. All right. So rather than read the whole question, let me summarize the question that I usually get at this point, which is, we have a tradition of working an 8 to 5, 40-hour week, and everything else is overtime. I will push back on you and say, that's great if you work in a traditional industry. We don't. There's nothing normal about our industry. It's 7 days a week. It's 26 hours a day. It's 400 days a year. We have a horrible, horrible schedule. So it's not unreasonable for your employees to say, I'm not going to have a normal schedule. Now, I was working with a client a couple weeks ago, and they wanted to put a job posting out there, and they were trying to find a way to easily say that it's a floating schedule. We have more work some week, less work other weeks. But I don't want people to think that we're going to short them hours. And I said, great. We ran a quick report, found out that on the average, his employees did about 46 hours a week over the course of a year. So we did the job posting at an average of 42 hours a week. So the average person in this position is going to work 42 hours a week. And that helped frame the job that it's not a normal 9 to 5 job. And then in the interview process, you can explain, yeah, sometimes I need you to take off on Thursday because I need you to work on Saturday. But you're going to get your hours. You're going to put groceries on the table. But that's the world that we live in. Now, the upside is you get to play with all this wonderful equipment and be in the entertainment industry. Well, sell that as best you can. Let me answer another quick question here before I move on. How do I convince my upper management that we are short-staffed? How do I produce the evidence? Thank you. Great question. It's called math. We need to do some math, okay? Look at the overtime, look at the alternative cost, and look at all the projects that you're not getting done. And you need to turn the things that you're not getting done into money. When I did this exercise and we were looking at new warehouse space, how can I justify a bigger warehouse and the extra expense? I started measuring the amount of time it was taking us to do things and to fix the mistakes of being too crowded, of having to find equipment, lose equipment, do last minute show site runs, things like that. So start adding up the cost of mistakes, and that's going to get you your evidence. Well, it ought to be, actually, that ought to seal the deal, if not make it a really good start. Thanks for the question. I want to talk about triggers and not handoffs. People know that if you talk about the handoff from sales to operations, I'm going to get up out of my chair and we're going to have a conversation. I don't like the idea of handoffs. I think handoffs are broken. I think it's the wrong problem. We can have much better problems than waiting on a handoff. So handoffs, when we're waiting for the salesperson to hand something off, we're giving them permission to do is isolate a client. And that's what happens. The salesperson says, well, I don't want people talking to the client. No, don't call them. I don't want to bother them. I'm managing the relationship. I don't want to ask them any questions. I don't want to force a decision. I don't think my information is correct. We're still talking about it. I can go on, and I'm sure you could as well. So we want to say, the information then becomes compartmentalized. I said, I don't want to give you anything if it's not confirmed. I can give you a little bit of information, and that may send you off in the wrong direction. The whole idea that client is still making changes means I can't give you information. That's the handoff. There's nothing good about that. Okay. Operations is then, their planning is then forced to be reactive. They're waiting for information, which is going to make them feel more busy. Okay. It's going to drive up costs. It's going to drive up stress. It's going to reduce the timelines. It's just making everything harder. Right? We don't like handoffs. What we want are triggers. Triggers are different. I got to give you here. I got to give you the Rogue Ops Guy solution to this. I'm trying to remember it doesn't matter what city I was in. We were talking about this problem in a company, and the ops guy goes, "I got a solution." I said, "So what is it?" He goes, "Here's what I do. I go into the system and change their order to confirmed." So what do you mean? He goes, you get a lot more activity. You get a lot more information out of a salesperson if you scare them. He goes, I want to panic them. I treat their job as confirmed, or sometimes I'll go in and I'll cancel it. And then they'll react. Then they'll start giving us information. We could do our job. And I said, isn't that a little dangerous? He goes, yeah, but I'm really fed up. I'm just fed up with it. I said, okay, let's modify this. Let's find a way to make this work. He also had the great threat. Said, well, tell you what, if you're saying the client won't tell you, I'm just going to call your client and ask. So this became a very toxic environment, but it gave us an idea about how you can do this. We want to make a plan so you can change it. So rather than just, arbitrarily, driving a salesperson crazy, why don't we create a classification or a status that says treating as confirmed? And treating as confirmed means that we need to start working on the job, because if we don't, the costs of working on it are going to be too expensive. In other words, it's easier to undo what we start than to play catch up. So we're going to start doing the things as if the job was going to happen. And if for some reason the job isn't going to happen or it changes, then I'll just undo those things. So that's a little bit softer way of doing that. But this led to the idea of triggers. Okay. If we can treat a job as confirmed based on the information that we see, saying, hey, we're seeing enough activity here. I've got some dates, I've got some times, I have some positions, I see a working project here. They may change their screen size. Who cares? Okay. I got enough information to start doing my job. Well, that's what a trigger is. So a trigger is something that gives you enough information. You have a baseline of information so you can start your planning. If the information is incomplete, it keeps your plan from evolving, right? So we can create baseline specs for missing information. This is another trick. Different guy, different operations manager. So I got two rogues in this story. If we have enough information, but we don't have, and tell me if I'm wrong, getting the delivery time or the setup time for some reason seems to be hard in a lot of organizations, so it gets left blank. One of my clients created a organizational delivery time of 10:17. It's the time when nothing delivers at 10:17. So if the delivery time was 10:17, we all knew it was a made-up time. So we're going to treat this job as if it's going to deliver at 10:17 in the morning. Some people use 8:07 or 7:58 or whatever it is as the default time. That tells all of us that it's a made-up time, but it gives us something to plan towards. So we have all the other information that we need. What can we do to move forward? We're going to make a presumptive spec. Okay. Another way of doing that is going into the order and saying we are assuming an 8 a.m. setup. And oh, by the way, it doesn't have to be ops that does this, salespeople. You can do this. My orders often would say, and I sold a lot of business, trust me, I don't have enough information from the client right now, but my numbers are based on an 8 a.m. setup. And ops would say, thank you, we can plan with that. And then they would come back to me and say, hey, we have 3 jobs loading at 8 a.m. Is this really going to happen at 8 a.m.? And I can go back and call the client and say, hey, my ops teams are saying that we can reduce some of your overtime if we load in at 10 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. Are you interested in that? Oh, yeah, I don't care when you guys load in. Off you go. So operations can take over client contact at a certain point, which is another thing a trigger does. So when there's enough information in the job, and this, again, I'm assuming at this point that project management is part of operations, why not take over the discussion with the client, let the salesman move on to the next job? So triggers are, we've gathered enough information that the next group that needs to act on the project can work. And they're not waiting to be told that there's enough information. They're seeing the information in their transparent information sharing system, and they're acting upon it. Okay? So acting on the trigger, if you're operations, you have to ignore missing information. You plan for what you know, and then you state the plan. Now, hungry jobs will become more forthcoming. In other words, if a job doesn't have a lot of information, but they see planning going on without them, they will start coughing up information. So if you do have a salesperson, for instance, in the rare cases where they do hoard information, they'll start being a little bit more forthcoming when they see that there are activity happening on their job. Yeah, great comment here. It says confirmation, same challenge here. Confirmation has different meanings to sales and ops. Should look at the intent to use versus the pick order set in stone. And that's right. You just need to be a little bit more flexible about it and be less concerned about wasted or double work, because it's not going to happen really that often. And the savings in the long run is much higher. Another question here, isn't a trigger and handoff the same as different? Okay, long way of saying it's a different way of saying the same thing. And I say no. The difference between a trigger and a handoff is that the receiver controls a trigger. The sender controls a handoff. So we're shifting control to in this case, the underdog, which is the receiver of information. They're acting on the information that's available. They're not waiting for the information to be complete. And once they start acting on it, that encourages the sender to provide more information. So a handoff is when the sender controls the sharing of information and the actions that follow. Trigger is when the receiver controls it. Thank you. Okay, last good story. And I always wish I had an hour and a half on these instead of an hour, because I want to tell so many stories. 2 to 1. So the story here is called, it's the halfway story. Years ago, many years ago, even before I started consulting, I preached 2 to 1 cable and accessories. You need twice as much cable and accessories as you actually own equipment. And here's where it really manifested. I had a client. I was doing evaluation, and I'm there all week, and all of a sudden I start hearing about halfways, and I had to stop and ask somebody what a halfway was. And a halfway was, they had 2 cities that were 6 hours apart. They had to share inventory. So twice a week, they had a truck from each city meet in the middle between the 2 cities, back up to each other, swap some gear back and forth, and then head back out again. So it was a halfway. It's like, okay, well, what are we trading on this? And I was hoping, oh, this was major systems, and we're doing some high volume, we're saving a lot of money on sub-rentals. And no, they were pushing cable, a case of cable off of one truck onto another truck. Cable. So I have so many words on this thing, but let me just tell the story. So we had 2 drivers, 2 trucks. It's a 6-hour round trip for each one. They were doing this 100 times a year. We did a quick calculation of what it was costing per halfway. We came up with that was conservatively $500 per trip, because management refused to use the overtime numbers I told them were appropriate in this calculation. They wanted to be used regular time. So it was costing $50,000 a year to back 2 trucks up in the middle of at a rest stop and swap cable. Well, hey, if you just bought some cable, maybe the problem would go away, but it was worse than that, okay? They were actually using overtime to do this, because they ran overtime every single week, and they ran overtime every weekend because they were having to move cable from one job to a next because they didn't have enough cable. They could pull the equipment, but they didn't have enough cable. So the halfways led me to discover they didn't own enough cable for all the equipment that they owned. And they needed a full crew to scan in a show because they barcoded and scanned cable because they had to, because they didn't have enough cable, and that's how they planned their halfways, and even worse, how they planned their cable sub-rentals. So now I got a full crew on overtime on Saturday night to unload a truck, scan in every cable, then scan it back out again. So the costs are adding up, right? You know me, I'm doing math. I got a spreadsheet going here. So they had at least one 4-hour call on overtime with 4 people. They're spending 40 grand a year in overtime just for extra handling on cable. And here's why they were doing it. Everybody remember VGA shredders? This is management's thinking, and not all management is this illogical. A VGA shredder costs $26 new. They could sub-rent it for $8. So on a job cost basis, it was less expensive to sub-rent a VGA shredder than it was to go buy one. And they did this over and over and over again. So now I'm adding up the sub-rentals on cable and the $150 for a driver and a van to go every time they went and picked up a handful of these cables. I mean, we're talking some real money here. So it got pretty mind-boggling. All of this was built on the fact that they simply didn't want to buy the cable they needed to run their business because they looked at it as a job cost instead of an overhead expense. All right, good. We solved it thanks to my rogue warehouse manager. He worked with me. He helped me find all the money. He helped me to figure out how much cable they needed. We actually put together a cable list, and then we got their purchasing guide to figure out how much it would cost. And we wrote out a $30,000 cable order and presented it to management, who dismissed it, refused to listen, refused to think that was logical. They waited until after I left, and then they actually did it. And when they did it, it cut their halfways down by 3/4. So that worked. So they added another $30,000 of cable. I'm now getting emails from the warehouse manager every time a cable shipment came in, and they got rid of their cable sub-rentals. Okay? In 1 year, the overtime to manage cables and shortages and the halfways had all been eliminated, and they'd spent $60,000 and they'd saved about $240. So thank you, rogue ops managers and warehouse managers. If you're solving a problem, you may go off the reservation a little bit. You may get outside of the lines, but that's exactly what we need. We need some common sense thinking. We need some math. I'll give you a couple summaries here in a minute. If we're solving problems, then we will change how we think about things. And all of this stuff, when I started in the business 35 years ago, all of these things were crazy, absolutely crazy. The best minds in the business would never have done these things, but now they seem like common sense because we're getting smarter, we're getting better at running business. So I've got time for a few more questions. I'll let you post some there. While you're doing that, remember to use the Q&A box. I want to remind you we have Jumpstart workshops. We've got 4 of them scheduled in 2018. I'll schedule the sales one as well. We just had strategy. It went great. Lots of great folks. A lot of people got to meet each other. You're getting outside your bubble. Probably one of the biggest values of the workshops. So take a look at those. I've got 3 more coming up. Operations is in May. I know May is busy for some of you. That may have been bad planning on my part, but I can't find a month where you don't think you're busy. So if you want to know how not to be busy in May so that you can go to things like this, come to this thing and I'll teach you how to do that. So if you go to trsimpson.com Jumpstart, registration is now open for operations. We actually have 5 companies already registered. I've got 15 attendees, and I haven't even publicly sent out a promo or anything. So get in early. Maybe there'll be a special treat for you early adopters. If you're not finding out about these things, make sure you're on my mailing list. Go to my website, click on download your free ebook. It'll grab your email address. You'll get a free ebook with some essays, which will be about things like, well, do the math. And you'll also get my newsletter, which is every Monday morning. So if you're getting the Monday morning newsletter, but you don't have the book, go register again. I'll give you the book. All right. And while you're there, if you'd like to have a conversation, or if any of you would like to talk about the questions you're posting that seem rather deep, schedule a free call. I'm happy to talk with you. I got a great scheduling program. I'll be happy to carve out 30 or 60 minutes and visit with you, because that's how I learn stuff, and I very much enjoy it. Next month's webinar, why we wear too many hats and what to do about it. So that whole idea, I've done this webinar before, it's been updated. We wear too many hats. Operations people are particularly poor about this, so I want to remind us of how we can do this and what the easy solutions for you are. And one more thanks to our sponsors. And here's a couple of takeaways, and then I'll grab what other questions we have time for. So 3 things. 1, do the math. So find some math that you can do to help things make more sense. If you can quantify something, you'll get more buy-in. Salespeople have an advantage, and I'm not trying to pit sales versus ops here at all. Salespeople have an advantage. They have the number everybody loves, which is revenue. Okay, if you're in operations, you just represent expense, and management needs to change that mindset. What you represent is gross profit, and gross profit is, trust me, more important than revenue. So revenue's fine. We love revenue. We need revenue to make gross profit. Anybody can get revenue. Having money left over at the end of it is ops, and that's what we do. So do some math, make a plan so you can change it. Okay? That's what we do. We're in the reactive business, and we will have to react less if we have a plan. So make plans so you can change it. And just change that whole busy mindset in your organization. Redefine busy. Don't let people say, oh, we're really busy. You need to say, no, actually, we're not. I'm looking at the numbers. I'm looking at the jobs. You're not busy. You're just acting busy. What can we do so you quit acting like you're busy? What can I do to help? So those are some takeaways there. I got one more question here, or maybe it's a comment. So the math for ops is a bit easier to do the math. What criteria and or KPI should be used in a business case to hire more sales coordinator positions to help sales management team focus on staying responsive to larger clients and growing them? All right. I think that, well, this is a thoughtful question in an operations webinar to say, what can we do to help sales out? Thank you. I get asked this question a lot in a lot of different ways, and the question is really, how much business can a salesperson handle, or should they handle? And there are answers to that, and that's probably worth a private phone call to talk about your particular situation. If I find, just to pick random numbers, if I've got a business type that should be, where a salesperson should be able to produce or generate about $2 million worth of business a year, but they're only able to do $1 million, I suspect it's because the processes the organization uses aren't ideal. And that may fall back onto operations. So the KPI that I'm probably going to use is, what's the revenue per individual that they should be able to generate. Alternatively, it might be gross profit per sale that they need to generate. So that might be part of the answer for a business case to hire more sales coordinator positions. The other business case is the forecast. Okay, if your salespeople are at their capacity, in other words, $1 million is all they're supposed to be able to handle, and everybody's at $1 million, well, obviously you're not going to grow. Everyone's at capacity. So we obviously want them to have higher capacity, and the more capacity salespeople have, the more efficient the organization is going to be. That makes perfect sense, right? So, well, there you go. That's another webinar. It's 2:00. Thank you guys for joining me. Again, I'll get this archived and posted for you so that you can share. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you attending. It was a great crowd today. Thank you for the great questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great rest of your day, folks.